and all around me, not just the river in front of me, but behind me, it's water. Oh, and just crab along that kind of fence line.
Double red maggot on the float and having 6 in an afternoon. It's definitely something that is underutilised in the winter. I can almost guarantee you that where bring the present, barbel will also be there
It's
too.
difficult fishing without a doubt. Yeah, you're always rubbing your hands. This is what we've been waiting for, you know.
I feed too much. And that's always the question that I'm asking myself when I'm not successful. Buts and maybes. You live in a world of hypothetical nonsense. On their day, they can be really, really, really easy to catch.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's not always the case.
Well, cheers for joining us, gents, in a new format of the Right Angle podcast. We're going to try a new panel format today. So hopefully we're going to talk everything winter barbel, help the listeners catch more barbel and bigger barbel this winter. And I've got, in my opinion, the 2 best men for the job.
So big
billing.
Yeah.
So we welcome James Denison onto the podcast for the first time. So welcome, James. Thanks for making
Absolutely.
quite a road trip this morning for you.
Always enjoyable though, especially when there's no traffic. So yeah, pleased to be here.
Where have you come from?
North Kent.
And you're the man behind the 40 Rivers Barbel Challenge. So just tell us a little bit more about sort of how that came about and what the sort of focus is.
The 40 Rivers Barbel Challenge actually came about during the closure of the world during COVID, and I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different in my fishing. There was certainly a cyclical nature of my fishing. I just thought I was getting trapped within, so I just wanted to actually branch out and do something a bit different. So what I wanted to do was utilise the fishing I had quite close to me, whether it be Medway, Thames, Lee, etc. I wanted to just see if I could find some good quality barbel close by, and then for some reason I just plucked 40 Rivers out of thin air and thought, let's go give it a go.
So the goal behind that is double figure barbel from 40 different venues. Mm-hmm. So you've got a list of venues that you want to achieve that from, or is it just wherever you can done?
To be fair, it's pretty fluid. Some of them will speak for themselves, but other rivers, shall we say, not necessarily go-to rivers for most anglers. So I would go Idle, Bristol Avon, which is on the up again once again, go up to the Tame, the Goit, Ribble, far-flung places where there's good quality barbel, but not really on the radar.
So you're a man who's fished a lot of different rivers, and so I thought you've got great credentials to come on today and talk about all things winter barbel.
Mm-hmm.
We welcome Tony Gibson back as well. Tony, you were on our first ever podcast episode, but you had so much good content that I didn't want to wait too long before you got back in the hot seat again.
That's sweet.
So yeah, we welcome you back on today.
Pleasure, thank you.
2-time barbel record holder and capture of the first 20-pound barbel, so your credentials kind of speak for themselves. Okay. So I'm hoping that between you've got some things in common in how you approach your barbel fishing, but hopefully you disagree on a few things and we can have a bit of a debate. That's what it's all about today, trying to brainstorm how we can help people catch more and bigger barbel this winter, because I suppose winter barbel fishing, if it's something you've done quite a lot of, then it doesn't have to be complicated, but it can feel quite daunting, I guess, can't it? It's, I suppose being out there at that time of year, targeting a species that some people just see as kind of a summer fish is, a bit different for some people. So I want to kind of go through all the different approaches, all the different methods, and try and make that accessible for people back at home, really. So I want to start by talking about timing, I guess. This is to start off with you, Tony, I guess. So how critical to successful winter barbeling is getting your timing right?
It's important, obviously. Barbel, like every other species, they're not feeding constantly 24 hours a day. Yeah. And there's always going to be better conditions than others. I don't really fish in the summer, in the warmer months anymore for me barbel fishing. So to be fair, good topic for me is because, I tend to, it's not really until September, October time, and I'm thinking about me barbel fishing, and then maybe if I'm targeting barbel fish from then till the end of the season. And there's a few reasons for that, but especially I think because I think the barbel are at their best. They're feeding then anyway. They clearly do, because you see the weights go up and such like, and I'm sure we see that on just about every river up and down the country. not just the ones that I've been fishing, that they're better condition, the weights are going up and such like. So obviously those sort of time of year suits them. But I think you're right. I think that's been a bit of a shift in a kind of almost an attitude and such like over the years. Certainly when I first started barbel fishing, or becoming interested in it, they were classed as a summer species, as you said. But that has, I think, slowly shifted over the years, and I would say, well, actually, maybe some, the big fish coming out the ooze and places like that, sort of record proportions and stuff like that has shifted people's kind of perception and ideas about barbel fishing. And I imagine there's almost as many people now sort of fishing for barbel during the sort of colder months, not winter months specifically, but certainly the colder months and what have you, autumn, winter, up to the back end, than they used to be sort of summer, fishing for them. And that's what I enjoy doing. I don't particularly like fishing for the barbel during the warmer months, especially when they're taking a long time to kind of recoup and recover, when you're landing them, they're giving their all. So I think it's better, it's more enjoyable. So better for the barbel, better for me. But then if we're coming down to specific sort of conditions and stuff like that, you only got to look at the barbel and see that they're built for the extra water. They're built for having plenty of water going over the backs and such like, hugging the bottom. They're made for it. And I think, like a lot of different species they have their own set of conditions where they can take advantage of the conditions over the other species, and that's when they'll kind of switch on and have a go for it. So it makes sense to fish for them during those times, and that's when there's extra water on, as far as I'm concerned. So rather than the low clear conditions, I'm looking for it, bit of rain, stuff like that, rivers coming up, colour and what have you, and that without a doubt turns them on, and they're on the feed. So it just makes perfect sense to be fishing for them when they're when they're feeding. It's just common sense, really. I mean, it's difficult sometimes. It isn't easy, and especially the bigger rivers and stuff like that. When there's a few feet on and it's coloured and there's loads of water going through, it can be pretty difficult fishing. It's quite a challenge. And if you haven't done that kind of thing before, it can be difficult. But I think just going out there and doing it, you pretty soon learn what to do, what not to do, and almost what sort of conditions can be manageable. Certainly, I mean, I'm talking about, saying, wait for some, wait for some rain and wait for the rivers to come up. But I mean, that first one, this year's a good example, actually. We've had sort of like quite a long summer, dry and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, a lot of rain, in that sort of autumn period, all of a sudden. And of course, it's usually windy as well and stuff like that. And then you get all the leaf fall, the wind blows all the leaves off the trees and stuff like that. The river comes up and it's full of everything. It's full of all the dead weed, it's full of all the dead reeds, it's full of leaves and stuff like that. And it's pretty horrible at times. And I mean, almost, it can be that first, especially like I say, that first flood, if you like, almost of the autumn or what have you, or winter period, it's difficult. And sometimes it's impossible. You think, I'll tell you what, I'll leave that. However, if you get the right conditions, when it's like that, when you get those, when it's been kind of low or relatively low, and it's coming up, that's the time to hit it without a doubt. That's when they're feeding.
What about yourself, James? Well, how much of your barbel fishing is done through the winter months, and how has your barbel fishing evolved, maybe in that context over recent years?
I would say over the course of the challenge, I've definitely adjusted the way I approach late autumn through to the back end of the season fishing for barbel. I must admit, probably within the first year or two, so the first 2 winters of the challenge, I was a bit more gun-ho because I was quite keen to chew into the numbers quite fast, but then actually learnt fairly quickly, especially spending a whole winter on the Cone for 1 7-pound barbel. It drove home just how difficult it can be when you don't get the conditions that Tony alluded to. if you don't get those conditions right, which I quite often didn't get right, I found myself fishing for probably nothing, absolutely nothing, not even a bite. But the fact that I was there, wanting to at least put in the appearances, you never know. You can't catch them at home. Have a bait in the water. There is just an outside chance of something. Didn't really happen for me, but that's the way it is. But as time's gone on, I've definitely adopted the approach of actually looking at the weather 2, 3, 4 days in advance, thinking, okay, we've had a prolonged spell of -2 overnight and 5 during the day. All of a sudden, you got this nice southwesterly systems coming in. Winds just completely shifted from northeasterly, easterly. And then you find an upturn in temperatures. And for me, it's not necessarily the daytime temps that's important. For me, it's the night times. So if you've got 8 in the day, but -2 still at night, you're not getting much gain. But when actually those temps in the evenings start to turn to 5, 6, 7 overnight, and you're getting 8, 9, 10 during the day, the water will respond in turn. And that's what I look for. In terms of external factors as well, beyond the weather as well, I find, and it's something we may touch on a little bit later, but things like crayfish activity, people don't really think about that either. During the winter months, the crayfish activity drops right off. It almost completely disappears. Therefore, then you can actually target fish, whether it be barbel or whatever other species you might be fishing for. But obviously, in this instance, we're talking about barbel specifically. You'll find that the crayfish activity dropping off, you could present a bait for barbel a lot better rather than having to worry about using hard hookers and recasting every 20 minutes. You know, you can't feed bait because you just draw more in. You know, you got those factors. Also, less anglers on the bank as well. So that's another big factor as well. Fish are less pressured, you know, and especially on rivers that do run clear, even during the winter, you know, you have to have so many factors in your favour in order to be successful. Bigger rivers, maybe not necessarily so much. But yeah, it's not necessarily just 1 or 2 things I think about. It's multifaceted. And when I do get my gear ready, I'm always thinking the river that I'm going to target, I will kind of have an idea what it is that I'm actually going to be faced with. So I adapt my tackle and bait approach accordingly. And that for me has served me well. Maybe there are some tweaks yet to make it the approach even better and be more successful as well in time. But over even the course of this 5 years I've been doing the challenge, I've definitely adapted different ways of approaching barbel during the winter, and I've found that it has improved my catch rate as well. And I think there's even more to come.
So it sounds like both of you have probably, lent towards spending more of your time after barbel in the winter rather than during the warmer months. And I think, I don't know if you guys agree, but I think our weather systems have kind of also changed in that favour. I think we can all agree we tend to get longer, drier periods through the summer now, often get warmer summers, but we often also therefore get very wet winters to balance it out. And I think those milder, wetter winters lean more towards barbel than any other species to target. Obviously, I suppose chub were traditionally maybe a key winter target, but those high water conditions don't lend themselves to successful chubbing, from my experience. And I think both of your barbel records were caught during the latter part of the season, Tony. Is that right? In the winter months, or
not so much the latter part, but you're right in terms of the sort of high water and stuff like that. And actually, it's maybe worth pointing out that actually not just maybe when it's at its highest, or even the kind of runoff, which I think again traditionally was probably the time. You see written down in all the advice and articles and bits and bobs and in the papers and that would say, wait until it's running off and stuff like that. Without a doubt, it's easier to fish when it's like that. But I think, to be fair, again, it's like I said about barbel, taking advantage of the conditions when it's coming up. That's when they're on. To my mind, you don't want to be fishing for them once they're fed and they're hungry and they're sitting there sort of burping and farting and such like, saying, well, that was great, you know what I mean? But they've had their fill. Absolutely. And then get your rods out. No, get in there early, get in there when it's coming up. It's difficult fishing, without a doubt. But that's when I've had my biggest fish, literally on the rise. And as you were saying, watching the weather, watching that forecast, waiting for it, and you go, yeah, I think it's Wednesday evening. That's when I need to. Classic example is literally this week. It's just exactly what you're on about. Spell of cold weather, then all of a sudden, warm evenings, warm nights. That's what you're looking for, and that's why I was out yesterday evening. Couldn't resist it. I wasn't going to. I thought, I'll be nice and fresh and such like, and pop up here and we do this. Nah, can't resist it. Got to be out there. And I was out there till late, do you know what I mean? And it wasn't successful, but it's making the most of those conditions, exactly as you were talking about, looking at the forecast, and for me, it's when that river's coming up, and that's when they're going to be on. And trying to get out there and, you just juggle it. Whatever you got to do, just juggle it about, family, work, whatever, and get out when that, in those good conditions.
But knowing that sort of thing only comes from experience. Of
course it does.
Watercraft, understanding how weather affects them.
And you're absolutely right. And I don't think that advice was the advice. I don't know, going back a while. I mean, I'm ancient now, so I mean, I can remember it. Do you know what I mean? But it wasn't. I mean, it was, like we say, summer species for a start. And then was it, actually, they do feed in the autumn and winter. It was like, wait for those floods to die off and such like. Without a doubt, it's easier because all the sort of leaves and dead weed and, what we've just been talking about and what have you, that's all flushed through and it's gone. And it's a lot easier, to keep your gear out there and such like, and you're not getting false bites or whatever the heck. But they've had their fill by then. You want to be targeting when it's coming up, and that's when they switch on. So, yeah.
There's clearly been a transition in the approach and the attitude towards barbel. I mean, I think my fishing's gone the same way as both of your own. I definitely used to fish for barbel really only in the summer and maybe the autumn. I think there's a famous Passion for Angling episode about autumn barbel, which is very evocative with the colours on the trees and the leaves coming down, and Bob James fishing for barbel on the Hampshire Avon. That's all very evocative. But I think you're right. I think there's clearly a lot of pros to be fishing for them in the depths of winter. As you said, there's less crayfish activity, there's fewer anglers on the bank. The barbel are at their biggest. They definitely pack on those pounds towards the end of the season. So if you're prepared to go out there and do it, there's a lot to be gained. In terms of timing, so we're talking about milder weather conditions, ideally with rain to bring the river up. A really good barbel angler once told me that the trend in the water temperature was far more important than the temperature itself. So if the water temperature was 2 degrees, but it was moving to 3, whereas if it was 3 versus going to 2, that was determining whether you'd go barbel fishing or not. Yes. Would you agree with that?
Yes. We're sitting here nodding our heads, absolutely. Yeah. It is, on the upward. So you can almost, and everything going up. So the water's going up, the temperature's going up, that's when
So do you guys carry thermometers with you to actually check that? Okay, yeah. That's a critical part of your winter equipment.
Kind of will know what the temperature is going to be before I've even stepped foot on the bank, just looking at the trend in weather. But some rivers just naturally flow really cold, especially the chalk streams. So they're naturally cooler. So that wouldn't necessarily be a big negative for me if I was going to, say, for example, target the mid-Hampshire Avon. It's going to run a bit cooler anyway, given what it's like. Whereas if I go to, I don't know, take the River Lee, for example, down in like Fisher's Green or something, I suspect it a little bit more susceptible to external influences like sewage works, increasing the temperature, etc. So I think they're little things just to look out for as well.
So you're saying there's actually a difference between a sort of like a more urban kind of environment, urban river, as opposed to sort of hill, mountain, sort of like fed rivers.
I think it does have a slight impact.
Interesting, yeah.
Incremental, maybe.
Yeah. Interesting. Something I haven't really thought about, but I can see where you're coming from.
Yeah, anything that's chalk stream fed is always going to be cool, even during the summer. You can be on the Hampshire Avon, and you look at, I think, the Hampshire Avon and the Dorset Stour. They run about 3 degrees, even though they run through fairly similar countrysides. There actually is about 2 or 3 degree difference between the two.
Interesting stuff.
You would imagine geographically running similar sort of paths to the same exit point.
Yeah,
you thought they'd run the same temperature, right? But they don't.
Yeah,
I think it's
that groundwater influence on the Hampshire Avon. I think, isn't it? It keeps it at a consistent temperature.
I think so.
Yeah, that is interesting. I suppose it's touching upon how we treat different rivers, which we'll come on to in a minute. But it's a really interesting point, is that you've got those weather trends, but each river is going to react differently to those same weather trends. And it's only that kind of knowledge that you've built by fishing that full range of different river types, where you've learned that. And interesting about urban rivers as well, because you're right. If a lot of that water's coming through runoff, or potentially even treated sewage effluent, dare I say, in a lot of our urban rivers, that water's already going to be at a higher temperature than water that's running off the countryside. So yeah, that's a really interesting point as well. So I guess you guys would now very much target your fishing around those times. It sounds like you wouldn't just get yourself out there on the bank regardless anymore.
Within reason. During the summer months, if I think that it's been quite a prolonged heated spell, I will leave them well alone. I can go eel fishing, tench fishing. I'll leave the barbel well alone until I feel that it's suitable to target them. I don't want to, especially being as delicate as they can be in warm water, you don't want to be putting through any additional pressure, and I'd like to think that anybody who did target them in really hot weather would look after them and go back well. But we're all too aware that during the hot months, unfortunately, you do see fatalities, and I don't want to be one of those anglers that will contribute to that.
So one final question around timing. Something that I've always struggled to get my own head around in the winter is, say you've got a prolonged cold spell, or say the weather is very up and down, like we've had recently. You might have a hard frost one night, it might be -2. The next day might be 10 degrees, but then the next day might be 5 degrees, the next day might be 13. That seems to be what we're getting at the moment. So I suppose is one day of double figure temperatures enough to get those barbel moving, or are you very much looking for a prolonged spell of change, I suppose? Tony?
I think you're right in that almost nowadays you can't. You're sort of forced into almost making a decision because, like you say, it's up and down and what have you. But I think it's going back to what we said about those upward trends, and it can be, within 24 hours, without a doubt. And it just needs to be a couple of degrees, but a couple of degrees going the right way. Mm-hmm. And that's enough to get out there and see those fish feeding. It certainly happened. I mean, it's almost ideal if you've got that long period, obviously, of sort of colder conditions and stuff like that, and then it comes good. Well, you've got to be out there, just drop everything, Sorry, kids, we're not having Christmas this year. You know what I mean? It's like, but you know what I mean. But I've done it myself. I mean, second record barbel for the first 20 was a classic example. I wasn't going fishing that day. And I think, the weather forecasts, as they have been, a bit unpredictable. But it was looking good almost from the sort of, getting out of bed and getting ready for work in the morning, and it's sort of like, oh, this is looking a bit better than the forecast. And I remember one of my mates, he'd got it right, and he'd gone out there and got out there pretty early. And this is a good while back. This is 20 odd years ago now when you think about it. And he'd got, because mobile phones for personal use weren't really quite so much of a thing back then. They certainly didn't. Everybody had them, so he had one of the early ones. And I had one for work, but I didn't have my own sort of. So, but he was on the bank, so I could phone him from work and sort of like, so I'm looking out the window. And thinking this is all right, and so of course I'm picking up the phone at work. What's it looking like? This is good, and what have you. And it'd been raining and stuff like that. And he said, you can see the rivers, just starting to come up a bit. Oh no! And then you're looking at forecasts, on your laptop and stuff like that. Yeah, it's just going to get better tonight. And so in the end, that was one when I had to just go, right, that's it. I'm cancelling my meetings this afternoon. I'm going fishing. I can say this now. I can admit to it and what have you. But that's exactly what I did. So sort of, rearranged, not to cancel, rearranged all my meetings and such like that afternoon. And it was off home and such like, and say, that's it. I'm off fishing. Don't worry. Do whatever. If it's cheap, but I'm going fishing and such like. And it was classic. It's exactly what we've just been talking about. Temperature rise, the river rising and what have you, all the rest of it just come good. And this was after a proper cold spell, So it had been down to, like you say, just days before, those sort of minus temperatures at night and frost and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's all looking pretty good. Yeah, get out there, take advantage.
I mean, it brings a whole new meaning to the term come hell or high water, doesn't it? You're going fishing. Because literally, come that high water, it sounds like you were going fishing. And it was well worth it. And
it absolutely was. I mean, when you say, from quite low with what, it ramped up. I mean, it was ramping up during the day. I was keeping in sort of contact with my mate and what have you, and he said, it's coming up properly. I mean, it was raining all day, and got there and remember, got one of these sort of poncho type things. Because it was coming down steroids. I mean, it was absolutely. And I remember getting to the river, quite a long walk to the river, leaving me kit with my mate sort of tucked behind his brolly as best I could, putting this poncho on, and then going off and looking along the river, sort of thing, trying to find where it was going to be. And I guess we're coming onto this sort of location and stuff like this later on, but looking for those bits of water where in the when it's coming up. And I mean, there was fence posts coming up. I remember a dead sheep, coming down the road. But you're going, you're almost rubbing your hands. This is what we've been waiting for, for a fortnight or whatever it was. Classic, ideal. And of course, it turned out in that instance absolutely was, But hell of high water, fence posts, dead sheep. That's what,
I suppose one final thing around timing that I think is important to consider is lag time. So do you guys think about lag time in terms of how long after that rain falls does it end up in the river where you want to be? Because that's something that I've had to learn on different river systems, and I guess your opinion would be really interested on this, James, as well, having fished so many different rivers, is obviously depending on how high up at the catchment you're fishing and or how urban that catchment is, and therefore how quickly that water runs into the river, kind of depends on when that optimal time is to be down there, doesn't it? Because sometimes the Lee, for instance, I've done a lot of fishing on the Lee. It's often at least 24 hours after heavy rain that you really see that in the river area that you want to be fishing. So I suppose, how do you consider that, and how do you find that affects how you treat different rivers?
It's a tough question, to be honest. With spate rivers, obviously, the water runs off quite quickly, especially if you're fishing the rivers up in Yorkshire. They get into the river quite quickly, and if you're fishing the Rother, the Don, the Dern, they're fairly large rivers, so they do take a little bit of time for the water to take effect. But I don't think that process is probably anything more than 24 hours. But given the lack of time I have available to fish, sometimes I don't get the opportunity to maximise those little gains that you may get. By the time I get there, I've missed the boat by 48 hours. So I'm finding myself fishing in probably least of the best conditions of that additional rain that's come in. Like Tony was alluding to, being there pretty much just as the river's beginning to rise, and just that 4, 5, 6 hour slot when the fish are really going to be getting their heads down and searching out. I'm getting there 48 hours later, and the fish have, as you say, they've pretty much fed. So you're picking up scraps, you're picking off fish that maybe didn't feel like feeding just there and then. So you might get the odd fish here and there. So that's one of the big difficulties with fishing so far away. But to go back to your question, I think probably 24 hours for most rivers is probably a fair assessment. Little tiny rivers. I grew up fishing the Wandle down in South London, and that being really diminutive, the impacts of rain were instantaneous. So within 24 hours, it would have risen 2 feet, shifted it all out, and back to clear and low again. So when you come to small rivers like that, the rain's effect is short and sharp.
So the bigger the river and the further down the catchment, the later you're going to see that peak flow, aren't you? And I guess for someone like you, Tony, you were mentioning about if you are flexible and you can try and get out there in the best conditions, I assume that's something you're thinking about a lot. When are you going to see that peak, and how can you get there to build up to that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah, and having a bit of flexibility around things, or just being ruthless. It definitely helps. And I suppose as well, it does depend on the time of year and the kind of conditions that you've had, because, we're talking about sort of autumn period when we've had a long, dry summer. Well, the ground soaks up some of that, a lot of that moisture and what have you, so you can have a fairly, and we kind of did earlier on, not so long back this year, quite a bit of rainfall, and it hardly touched the rivers because the ground just slurped it all up, But then after that, once you get into the sort of late autumn and winter proper, and everywhere is already sodden, you can have a bit of rainfall and it's whoosh, and it's straight in there, straight into the river sort of thing. And almost you might have, if you haven't got that flexibility, you haven't got the time to sort of react and go, oh great, I need to be out there and what have you, and you start your planning. And like I say, you can. I guess and it must happen to you an awful lot. You just missed the boat. You've got to get out there because you've done the planning and such like, and you've juggled things around. So you might as well go. When it's an opportunity to go, you might as well go. However, makes it more difficult. It's time of year as well, and I think the sort of state almost of the ground and what have you, whether it's dry or whether it's sodden, makes a difference to how quickly the river can react to that rainfall. So worth bearing in mind as well. It's.
I guess that's an important caveat to some of this conversation. I suppose we're really talking about, from my perspective, maybe sort of this time of year onwards, late November, December, and for the rest of the season. Because as you say, when you've got vegetation still on the ground, you've still got leaves on the trees, then that rain doesn't have the effect on the river that it would do later in the season. And I guess I'm talking about those periods when you've already got saturated ground. And like you said, that rain is really effective and it has a very instant impact on the river. And I think you can even get to a point where you know how much rain you need to see the river in the state you want it. Yeah. When you get in tune with a certain system. I don't know, I'm sure you must have done that with the Grey Twos.
Well, that's right, yeah, indeed. And like you say, the rivers you become familiar with, Grey Twos to a bit of an extent, I guess, and then people around here, the Trent, they'll know come, like you say, October, November, ground starting to get sodden, they'll know. Almost again, it's looking at forecast rather than reacting to something. They're looking at the forecast and going, oh yeah, this weekend looks all right. It's got a bit of rain on Friday and such like. Yeah, Saturday, Sunday, it's going to be spot on. Yeah.
Have you managed to get into tune with any particular rivers like that, James? Have you managed to understand rivers to the extent where you go, I know we're going to get 4 hours of heavy rain. I know what that river's going to look like before I get there.
Yes, some of the rivers that I'm still yet to chalk off, I've spent a considerable amount of time on, like the Blackwater, the Kentish Stour. I've spent between the two over 50 visits, still haven't chalked them off. I've kind of built up that picture now where I know when it's no point going, or I know when the ideal time is to go. And bearing in mind, they're my two closest rivers that I haven't chalked off yet. They're both, I think, 61 miles each way. So they're what I would deem as local. To most people, that sound like utter madness. Mm-hmm. But to me, a 120-mile round trip now is actually close to home. And I do know those rivers pretty well now. I know roughly where I need to be for the Barbel, and I know roughly what times I need to be there too. The effects of the rain for both, the Kentish Stour is actually quite a big river. I think people don't realise. I think, if I remember right, it's about 70 miles long. So it's pretty big catchment of Kent is drained through the Kentish Stour. The Blackwater is not as big, and that pumps into the Loddon at Swallowfield, I believe. And that floods really quickly, but does tend to drop away unless they get very sustained water. And then obviously you got quite a lot of sewage works on the Blackwater catchment as well. So that obviously adds quite a lot of water to that too. But there are times when that's 3-4 feet up. It's very hard to get to the banks. So not an awful lot of water makes it relatively unfishable unless you really know what you're doing. And that might be something we'll touch on later in terms of location, a time of a bit of safety as well on top.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I suppose just to wrap up this whole timing question, I've said that about 4 times now, but it's actually possibly the most critical part of successful winter barbeling. So I guess it's important that we've laboured the point. But I guess the other thing is some catchments, particularly urban catchments, are more flashy, what people would call flashy, in terms of their peak of flow happens quite quickly, but it also drops off very quickly. So I guess that's the other thing to bear in mind, particularly if you're not as flexible and you can only get there over the weekend. You can't make yourself flexible in the week to get there in the best conditions, is that those conditions may last only a day or two. Certainly on rivers like the Lee, you might have a peak, but after 48 hours, it's almost back to normal level again, and you wouldn't think anything's ever happened. Whereas I think some rivers like the Ouse, maybe, and some of the big rivers, those floods can sustain longer. Yeah. So I guess you've got a bit of a longer window to maybe get there in those conditions that are better. So I guess worth bearing that in mind if you're trying to time your fishing. So I think you mentioned location towards the end there, James. So we'll start with you on this topic. So I guess it's winter. The rivers are generally more coloured. You're probably not going to see barbel visually. So how do you even start locating them? Where would you even begin, especially on a river that you've not seen in the summer? Maybe
it comes with its challenges. It really does. you use a watercraft that you've built up over the years, and that only comes with trying to learn from failures of past sessions over the years. You learn where to present a bait, you learn how to read the water, something that I'd like to think that every good angler applies, whether it's on a water they've been to 1,000 times before or never been before. Look for those areas, use the power of social media, people who live in those areas, with the 40 Rivers Barbel Challenge, I get people messaging me on a fairly regular basis, like, have you done this river yet? And I respond, obviously, and say, I haven't, I do have plans. And then they'll give you like little areas of where you can go to, and give you like a starting block. And also clubs, it's always good looking on the websites, finding out areas that do barbel, and then you just try and build up a bigger picture before you've even stepped foot on the bank. So you can utilise social media, first of all, to your advantage. Once you get on the bank, then it's a case of understanding where you feel barbel in the summer will spend their time is most likely the time where they won't spend their time in the winter. So you've got to look for areas that are probably more beneficial to them. So in greater flow, yes, they're designed to be in fast water, powerful water, but barbel don't want to be consistently expending that energy that they're building up over the autumn and winter period. They want to hang on to that larder for when times are really tough. So they will seek out areas that are slacker, but with advantageous flows close by, looking for creases, looking for overhangs, undercut banks. There's various different things to search out. And it's understanding how to find those spots, first of all, that could certainly lead you in the right direction as to where they could be. And the river could be completely coloured. It could be up 2-3 feet on its normal levels. You've never been there. Most anglers will feel just completely daunted by it. And feeling daunted by it is not an unusual feeling. I felt it myself, and most anglers, including you two, probably have as well. You turned up to water and you thought, bloody hell, where do I start here? But it's first of all utilising those bits of watercraft you've built up over the years, and then try to fall back on that, and that will often lead you to places actually where the barbel are. And then it's, how do I approach it? In the winter, are barbel going to feed as avidly as they do in the summer? No, they don't. Are they a lot more picky in terms of the areas that they will feed and the times they feed? Yes, they are. So you don't want to feed too much. You want to keep it relatively simple. You don't want to overcomplicate it, and you don't want to be feeding extensive areas. You want to keep everything really localized. And as I say, utilize things like creases, understand where the water's flowing, understand roughly where those fish might be sat. They could be right under your feet. And I see people making that same mistake time and time again, casting 6, 7, 8 ounce lead zats in the middle of flow and struggling to hold. It's most often where they're not going to be. They're going to be in 3, 4, 5 feet from the bank. They might even be right under where you're sat. So it's margin fish as much as you possibly can. The margins are there to use. They are probably, during the winter, my go-to. I will almost sit 10 feet back from the bank, my rod sticks, my bank sticks in the ground next to me, and I'll have just about a foot and a half of the rod over the lip of the bank, and I'm fishing right down under there. Just enough weight to hold bottom, feeding very little, quite often only using a 15mm boilie with a little bit of paste wrapped around, and that is it. During the winter, it's the scent. Everything's about scent for me, not about size.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to the location aspect with you in a minute, James. In terms of you, Tony, so I suppose for me, I feel like your speciality is low stock, small rivers. I suppose views kind of fitted that bill back in the day when you were fishing for those big fish. So, say you turn up to a stretch of a river that fits that character in the winter, and you're not that familiar with it. Where do you even start looking for barbel?
Well, there's a couple of things for a start, because very rarely will I just turn up blind. You've got to have some idea. I mean, James touched upon the social media kind of thing, just contact with other people and stuff like that. You've got to do a little bit of homework, I think, just to maximise your time on the bank. It makes sense to do that. So very rarely turning up completely and utterly blind. And there's a couple of things as well. You only get this, mind you, I think, through experience. And I don't think we've touched upon it yet. But there tends to be a trend. I've certainly seen it. I'd be interested to get James's view on this, actually. Barbel do tend to drop back. as those, the floods and such like, more and more floods drop back from those sort of summer positions and such like, in each progressive big flood seems to just push them further down. This is kind of a natural thing, and it does change, I think, and it is, affected by, bait, because bait can hold them somewhere. If there's enough people sort of baiting up a spot and stuff like that, it can change that kind of natural thing. But going back to the natural thing, I think barbel tend to drop back each successive flood, and I think dropping back into exactly those kind of areas you were talking about earlier on, where it's just easier living. And that applies, I think, whether it's like the situation we're talking about with me and perhaps those, the ooze barbel and the nen and stuff like that, where you've got few fish but big. And I think the same thing applies as well probably to the trend of a few years ago when, it's full of fish and stuff like that. They're not going to want to just use all of that energy and resources and stuff like that just to maintain themselves in a stretch of river where they could drop back in somewhere a lot quieter, steadier and what have you, still get that food coming to them. It makes sense. It's just a natural thing to do. So going back to the question you asked, I'm looking for those kind of areas where fish would drop back to, especially if they're, I'm thinking big old lazy fish, maybe experienced sort of thing, like me, getting, want an easier life kind of thing rather than running around all over the place, and sort of dropping back into those sort of steadier bits of water. Very often, like you say, they can be close to the bank, in areas where before it was, just too shallow, too whatever. That bit of extra water can turn different areas into those nice, and so that's what I'm looking for, sort of steady glides and stuff like that, which, to be fair as well, you're usually a bit easier to fish. And especially getting close to the bank, easier to fish again, you know what I mean? But it kind of works for both us as anglers and the fish themselves. Those, you're looking at the surface of the water, and that will tell you something about what's happening underneath. You get those sort of smooth areas and what have you. Might be kind of fairly boring looking straits if you were just looking at the river itself. But if it's got that sort of steady glide, especially closer in and stuff like that, you think, that's worth a go. But it can be you're looking at your bends as well, sort of thing, and a main push, maybe pushing out over the far side, but you've got this lovely sort of like bit of slacker water, those creases that you were talking about. You think, okay, the edge where that's great, it's still going to be fairly deep, but it's going to be just nice and gentle, just this side of it. You can almost drop your bait in and what have you, drop your rig in and just let it bounce around and, settle into that, nice bit of calmer water and what have you, where they're going to still see plenty of food coming through, but they can just sit there all nice without expending all that sort of energy and what have you. And, so looking for those kind of areas, and usually the water itself is kind of telling you that. I mean, some of it's experience and such like, but looking at it and seeing that kind of gentleness almost, and you get it in the river, whatever condition it's in, and it will change. So sometimes it just needs just walking and looking and and what have you, but it will definitely come with experience. But just looking for those gentle bits of water and what have you to in specific swims, and they may only get 2 or 3 half a mile of water or whatever. But they'll always be the places I'll target before getting a bit more experimental, if you like, and what have you, because they can turn up anywhere. And in the situation that we're talking about, where you're talking about just odd fish, location gets difficult, and sometimes you just got to go, okay, right, try the more obvious looking areas or what looks to be, and then just try all the other bits and bobs, process of elimination kind of thing. You can help yourself to a little bit. I mean, I alluded to it earlier on with a bit of bait. And just, places that look nice, well, just keep them well fed. And hopefully they'll turn up eventually, after all. I mean, I think barbel are a kind of, don't want to get onto bait too early, but barbel are kind of almost like the carp of the rivers. They don't tend to turn away from a ready supply of good food. So you can make what's already a decent looking swim Don't get me wrong, just pick any old rubbish and what have you, but a decent look at it, you can make it a bit better with bait, without a doubt. You got to bear that in mind. But yeah, places where it looks easier for them to be, they're my first sort of targets, yeah?
There are probably a couple of themes there, I would say. I probably gave you a bit of an unfair question, in fairness, to start with James, and saying that what would you do if you turn up to a stretch in the winter that you've never seen before? I suppose the advice number one is don't do that, for a start. Try not to only turn up when the river's 3 foot high, having never seen the stretch before, knowing nothing, because that is a difficult scenario for any of us to be in. I suppose, yeah, it's important what you said about that feeling of being daunted. I think that's not unusual, like you said, even for very experienced anglers on a new stretch. I think that, you've almost got to be comfortable with feeling out of your depth, because it is hard finding barbel in new rivers, and particularly in the winter. So yeah, do your homework. I suppose that's the key. Be that through walking the river in the summer, contacting people, getting as much info as possible, make it as easy as it can be. I guess snags are always synonymous with barbel. So I suppose maybe one for you, James, again, how do you view snags in terms of holding areas in the winter versus the summer? Are they as important to you?
I would say yes. I would say some rivers, some sections of rivers, barbel probably frequent them areas all year round. I can't imagine that they move away from them or very far. Maybe during the summer they might maraud fairly close by, but that will always be the holding spot. And it was just, before we carry on with that, it was just something I'll go back to what Tony was saying, is with winter fishing as well, when you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 extra feet of water running through, actually floodwater fishing can be slightly easier to fish, for the simple fact that those barbel are not going to be hanging out in the main flow. They're going to be condensed into those areas. And I feel that normally snags will tie into that. There will quite often be a snag there, like a leaning over oak tree with a big root system, and it's been carved out over years, and the bank is just all gnarly, or roots everywhere, and you can just know that those barbel are tucked under there. There's maybe 24 barbel all wedged under with a load of chub and a couple of bream. You just know that that's exactly where they're going to be. It's how you present the bait and I'm not really a snag angler in terms of putting a bait right on their front door. I will always try to give myself some leeway. So if I was to get a good take in flood water, I want to make sure that I've got enough time to react and to make sure that fish does not head down there, because they know the water better than anything else. They know exactly how close they are to home. So giving yourself enough opportunity to make sure that fish doesn't go back down there. So I do utilize snags, but I don't fish on top of them. I will always try and draw them up. Again, something I said earlier about scent. I'll always try and use something really pungent, because obviously you've lost your clarity. So the fish aren't going to be responding on that. It's going to be purely scent in that water. So something that is very localized. Don't tend to use a lot of bait at all. Sometimes just single bait with paste, and try and draw 1 or 2 out. If I can build competition through that scent, brilliant. Because then that will mean that those fish will then be vying for what is actually just a single bait, as opposed to a scattering of 30 boilies down there for 10 barbel. They're going to consume those and then just drop off, and they'll be waiting for more. Great, no problem. But in winter, that doesn't really happen. You're going to get the occasional little feeding spell, come up, grab your bait, and off it goes. And yeah, something again we'll probably touch on later in terms of feeding during the summer and feeding during the winter. My approaches are very, very different. And but I don't want to pull too much away from the snag side of things. I will fish them, but I won't fish on top of them. Never.
What about yourself, then?
Yeah, I agree with a certain amount of that, but I think almost my least favourite, and this is a personal view, and I think because of some of the things you were talking about there, it is that they can be just dangerous places to fish. And especially when it's up and coloured and stuff like that, and you can't really see what's going on and maybe the extent of the snags and stuff like that. Sometimes that's going to be the home, without a doubt. Totally agree that, and that's where they feel comfortable, like I say, all year through. Those snags and stuff like that. But I would rather fish other areas of the river, or on that stretch if I can. But then if you go, okay, this isn't catching me any fish here, I think we've got to conclude that they're in the snags, you know what I mean, sort of thing. Almost have no choice, and then go exactly, I think especially in the winter months and such, like when you can't see what's going on, you can't fish to them too close and such, like you can't risk it. It's a silly thing to do, and you've got to do exactly as you're talking about there. Try and pull them up out of the snags, so you're not fishing down into the snags and stuff like that. You're pulling them away from them and you're using that. Okay, I know they're there, but you've got to try and pull them up with bait, with smell, with whatever, and fish safe.
And you may only also get one shot.
Yeah.
During the winter, sometimes the feeding spells are 10, 15 minutes, and that's your lot.
That's right.
So you've got to make the most of it. So fishing on top of it and then losing that one opportunity, it's unforgivable.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure that you put as much of that swing in your favour as you possibly can when that bite comes. Fishing on top of a snag just to try and, in your mind, guarantee a bite doesn't always work like that. Try and bring them up, because that fish is obviously engaged with your bait because it's come that far away from the tree. You know it wants it. When that bite finally comes, you've given yourself a good opportunity to actually bank it.
I think it's important to emphasise that kind of responsible angling, particularly in the winter. But I guess what I was just thinking about as you both were talking there is snags aren't only holding areas in the winter, but they are also what influence the flow dynamics a lot more. So obviously in the summer, they may not be influencing the flow hugely, but they are a holding area. But it's in the winter that they are the things that are causing those creases and those slacks. So they're another reason to be, I suppose, aware of and look for them, because they're changing the flow dynamics and then might provide the creases that you do want to be fishing to, even if you're not fishing directly under the snag themselves. So a couple final things around location, I guess. I think this is probably one for you, James, to start with. How do you find the location of barbel in the winter varies on different river types? So I suppose, what kind of swims would you be looking for on a spate river versus a chalk stream versus a lowland river like the Colne and the Lee? Are there different features that you'd be looking for?
No, I think the places where I'd actually look to target barbel on any of those rivers would be just thinking about the fish rather than myself. Where would I sit up? Where would it be easier for me to eat? Am I going to expend loads of energy in main flow, or am I going to sit in there? So regardless if I'm on the Ribble, for example, big sweeping bends, 9, 10, 11 feet on the inside bend, you think, the barbel going to be sat there. No, they're probably going to be at the tail end where it then starts to head out away from the bank, creating an area of much slacker water. It's probably where I'm going to fish. But being very careful, because obviously spate rivers rise really rapidly, and if you're not cautious, that you don't understand the full effects of what's unfolding in front of you, you can find yourself in trouble. So when you're fishing big spate rivers, there's other things you got to think about as well. Not necessarily your fishing, but everything around you. So many factors to bear in mind. Whereas come away from spate rivers and go onto lowland rivers like the Colne, for example, much more sedate areas. There are probably a lot more places you could actually target the barbel. Might be harder for you, because on a big spate river, you're going to have a bend every 3/4 to 1.5 miles. So you can pretty much narrow down your target area to just one crease. The barbel could all be just channeled up in there, just waiting for that food just to come charging around the bend, down into the gully that's going to be chiseled out by the constant floods over the years. Barbel will all be hanging there, whereas you go on the Colne, go on the Lee, there's going to be certain other things you'll be looking for. As we said earlier, you're looking for snags, so you're going to be looking for areas that are created behind those snags that are going to be slacker. You just try and pull them fish away from that and feed that. I don't think, in terms of most of the rivers that I've fished, that actually my approach changes very much at all. I think I would probably have 3 core elements that I will look for, and I will apply that to everywhere I go. And if anything, so being fluid, having those 3 core things, but also remaining focused as to what other elements I've got to take into account as well. But location definitely is the biggest thing with barbel. There's no point you being somewhere where they're not, and using that watercraft, using the knowledge that there's snags that's mostly going to hold up fish. They're not going to be in the fast glides. They're not going to be in 2-3 foot of water over shallows where the water is ripping through. There's no point trying to hold bottom in areas like that. They're not going to be there. when you go to much clearer waters during the winter that tend to be mainly chalk streams. There's a couple that will buck that trend, that run clear but aren't chalk streams. You can still have the ability to actually stalk them, and they tend to run off much faster. So you can maybe sometimes adopt tactics that you would during the summer, actually during the winter as well. And some people feel that that's probably not possible, but it is. You can maybe not necessarily feed the same way, but you can fish the same way, especially if the rivers have sent all of that water through and you can try and introduce feeding. It can be done. So actually with rivers that are murky and deep and slow, there'll be things I'll be looking for, whereas with slightly faster, medium-paced to fast-paced rivers, I might actually look for a few other little things, like even just a simple depression in the bottom, in the middle of the river. You might think, is that probably the best place during the winter I want to be looking for? Sometimes just searching those 6, 7, 8 foot depressions that are maybe a foot or two wide behind a little boulder might be enough to hold a couple of barbel. In the depths of winter, people would automatically discount that and just go somewhere where they think a snag will be holding everything. It's always the case with the smaller rivers, especially when it runs clear most of the year. They don't necessarily feel unsafe. They're used to their surroundings. Whereas the bigger rivers, where they get coloured up and everything, you can switch from visual to scent. And during the winter on the clearer rivers, I will quite often use a visual approach. Rolling meat, for example, is a good way of doing it. And you learn so much as well because you're on a very mobile approach. Whereas bigger, slower rivers, I tend to fish 30 to 45 minutes per swim with a big smelly bait. If I haven't had anything, move. But don't discount it, because even though you haven't had a bite then, moving around, come back, maybe picks 5 or 6 swims on a 1.5 mile stretch of river that look like they could hold fish, and just bunny hop 35, 45 minutes in each swim. And if you haven't done anything, move to another swim, but don't discount it. Just because I've had a bite, come back and give it a go maybe 3-4 hours later once you've come back to the beginning of the cycle. And that during the winter can be a very good approach. Some people will just pick a spot and be like, right, I'm just going to do 12 hours in here. And sometimes you will catch fish because you will get it location right. Sometimes you won't get it right on the first or second or third swim. Moving around and adopting that roving approach even during the winter is still a very good way to locate fish. And once you've found one in the winter, you've often found more. So then it's a case of setting up your stall and try and extract more out of that little pod, whether it be 2 fish or 22 fish, you don't know. But the fact that you found one, barbel being shoalfish, that would be the area then I'd focus. And I would then focus on that in subsequent trips as well. Big spate rivers, they get moved around a lot, but they will always come back when the flow is really fierce. They will always come back to those areas where they got to do the least amount of work.
What about yourself, Tony? I know you've done a bit of fishing on the Trent, as well as obviously your previous fishing on the smaller rivers. How do you find that location differs? I mean, apart from everything being on a bigger scale, I guess.
That's it. It doesn't really change all that much. And I think James is what he's saying there. It's almost backing up the idea that the characteristics of a good swim are characteristics of a good swim wherever you happen to be, whatever river you're on. And just scaling up, from, I don't know, say the Ivel to the Trent, you're still looking for the same kind of things, those depressions, those areas of calmer water and stuff like that, just on a different scale. And I've got to admit, I mean, really the Trent is the only big river, I'd say, that I've had any amount of experience on. Prefer me more sort of intimate fishing on the smaller rivers, the Grey Twos, the Ivel, the Nen, and what have you, and not so much on the bigger rivers. But the idea of what you're looking for and what the barbel like are similar. And I've got to admit, I quite admire, because it's difficult on the bigger rivers to get an idea. You can again look and see that sort of surface movement and stuff like that, and you're looking at the bends and the inside and of the creases and such like, the same as you're doing on the smaller rivers. But to still find, I think that almost little area, I think that you're alluding to earlier on, that little area within a swim, that real sweet spot. And finding them on the bigger rivers, I've got to admit, I really admire guys that can do that, And sometimes I think it's just through experience and just fishing them and getting to know them. But guys that can turn up and sort of look at then, they're letting about and using whatever they've got at their disposal to learn about the nature of the riverbed and stuff like that, and sort of figuring out, before they've made a single proper cast and such like, just there is where I need to be putting a bait. Mm-hmm. It's a good skill. And that's going to put you in good stead forever. Learning those skills, learning those sort of location skills, especially on the bigger rivers, difficult. And sometimes it will probably take a little bit of trial and error. And sometimes error on the big rivers is like, it feels pretty daunting. And it goes back to what we said quite earlier on, I think, about the big rivers with with lots of water and stuff like that. Daunting prospect. But if you can manage them and start getting to grips and start catching fish and getting bites and stuff like that on those, well, that's going to put you in good stead forever. And those location kind of ideas and skills, can't beat it. Once you've got an idea of what you're doing, it's transferable, and obviously quite clearly that's it. That's what you're doing an awful lot of, is taking those ideas and taking them to all these different rivers and getting success on them and such like. You're almost, proving that it works. Mm-hmm. You've got ideas of the areas to look for and what have you in the first few rivers you fish. It's transferable to almost anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess it's like it's having those basic principles that you can keep applying. So you need to be flexible enough to know that every river is going to be a bit different, but there's also some key principles that apply regardless of where you are. So once you've got those and you're confident, then you can pretty much go anywhere and feel like you can at least have an idea of locating the barbel. But I'm kind of like you, Tony. Like, I find those big rivers really quite daunting. Like, bizarrely, particularly the Trent. Although there are probably more barbel in the Trent than almost every other river in the country combined, I think I read someone say once that the whole Trent is like one big barbel swim, which I kind of see it is. Almost every swim looks like it could hold barbel. So that does feel like a daunting prospect. And yeah, similar, I have massive respect for anyone who can commit themselves to that task. But I suppose the other thing that's running through this whole conversation is the idea of floodwater fishing, because I guess there's a big difference between floodwater fishing in the way I'm visualising it to just general barbel fishing. Even in the winter, you've got the conditions that are good. You might have mild temperatures, a bit of rain, slightly higher coloured water, and then you've got full-on floodwater fishing. So let's just talk about that for a few minutes, because I think that's a very different experience and a very different style of fishing, I guess. So how does location differ if you actually fish in floodwater? Let's maybe start with you, Tony. So let's say you get to the river, you've moved your meetings, you're at the river, it's raging through, it's the colour of the coffee that you've just been drinking, there are some dead sheep coming down. Where are you even heading for versus where, so you know where the barbel often are you heading to the same places, or are you looking for different areas? You're
looking for those visual clues to start off with. So you're looking for that calm looking water, and we keep on going back to it. That turns out to be easier to fish as well, but it's where the fish are going to be, at that time when the river's at its angriest and stuff like that. The fish aren't looking to make their lives difficult for themselves on a daily basis. They're looking to, where can I get my easy pickings? Where can I have an easy life? Especially, I think that almost the bigger they get, perhaps more experienced. I'm not quite so sure what it is, but the bigger they get, I think they're looking for that kind of environment. So you're looking to get away from that raging water. Those boily fast currents and stuff like that, where they're forever going to have to be sort of dodging about and moving around, and somewhere where they can, I'm not saying lay up exactly and what have you, but be comfortably sort of on that riverbed and just concentrating on grubbing about and getting their bellies full. So you're looking for that calmer water, and like I say, visual clues and such like is on the top, and it looks calmer. The inside of bends, the classic creases that we were talking about earlier on. You've got some boily and fast stuff going on one side, and then you've got this kind of crease and what have you, and there's got this silkiness on the other side, well, go for it. That's where they're going to be. They know where the food's going to come from and what have you, but they can lay out of that, sort of raging current and wait for the food to be brought to them in a reasonably sort of comfortable surroundings, if you like. I mean, there's other places, like I say, you're not going to get it right all the while, and it's not just a sort of, prescripted kind of like, this is what you're looking for and such like. They'll always be there, because I mean, they're living fish, they move around and what have you, and all sorts of different factors can come into play. Predation, just fishing pressure, whatever, can move fish around. So can, like I alluded to earlier on, so can anglers' baits. And it may not necessarily be the classic swims, and maybe just somewhere where it's close to the car park and stuff like that. And that's where people go on a daily basis, and they know where they get fed. Like, I don't know, swans and such like, and ducks at your local park. If they were sort of naturalised, they'd be probably spread around the lake and such like, and eating weed where it grows up, rather than by the car park where people are chucking stale bread at them all day. But good swims are good swims all the while, and fish will end up moving back to them, even if they're getting free food elsewhere. Predation, getting caught, whatever, will move those fish around back into those sort of good natural swims again. So it's worth finding out. It's worth learning that sort of swim location kind of experience and stuff like that. And even if it takes trial and error, I mean, just sometimes on the bigger rivers, especially, it's like just chucking out a lead and seeing what happens to it. Is it holding? Is it bouncing around? And some places may take you by surprise. You're chucking out 3 ounces, 4 ounces, whatever, and it's going boom, 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 and it's disappearing. You think, oh, blimey. And you move somewhere else, maybe just 50 yards down, it looks pretty similar and such like, and then all of a sudden, 3 ounces is holding there quite nicely. And so you think, oh, right, yeah, well, if I was a barbel, that's where I'd be then, So
There are a couple of sort of floodwater location principles I feel like I've learned. I'd be really interested to get, I suppose, your opinion on these, James, and also what Tony said, and then also your opinion, Tony, on my thoughts, because they could be completely different. But I think one of them is, in a flood particularly, try anywhere that looks good in that flood, even if that's miles away from anywhere that barbel are normally caught from, because they do have a habit of turning up in some strange areas in a flood. Like you said, like cattle drinks, which are normally dry, areas of literally bank that you'd normally be fishing on. Yeah. Those sort of areas, if they form a nice crease, can be a fantastic area to fish. I remember one particular winter on the Lee, really struggling over a couple of sessions, only fishing in big floods. I just thought I should be catching in these conditions. Even it's a difficult stretch, but in those conditions I felt like I should be getting a bite, and I wasn't. And I remember walking back to the car one evening, and there was a very subtle crease had formed in a swim that I normally would just walk past, because there's kind of nothing there, really. And I dropped a bait on that crease, and I think I had a 17 within an hour or so. And that then became a spot that I then targeted, throughout that winter. But it just looks good in those conditions, and that was kind of the thing, I suppose. So that was one thing, sort of try anywhere that looks good. The other thing was trying slightly upstream or downstream of the normal holding areas. That seemed to be something that came into play, particularly if those upstream or downstream areas are a bit shallower under normal conditions. Because I found that sometimes those barbel weren't a million miles away from where they typically were, but they had moved a bit, I think, to almost explore what had become available under those higher flows. So I suppose, what are your thoughts on all that, James? And then I suppose back to Tony as well.
To an extent, I would agree with that. I would never rule out a specific area. If I knew fish were holding in a certain area, I wouldn't just necessarily target that, knowing that's the only place they were going to be. But that's where other techniques come into play. I'm a massive advocate of rolling meat. I absolutely love it. It's my favourite technique of all species. It's a very good way of working out A, topography. B, sometimes you can pick up a fish, even in flood water. If you can present it just very, very, very slowly, notching across the bottom, sometimes you can pick up a fish off of where you believe the main pod is. And that can open up new fishing to you as well. So things like that can certainly help. But also another thing that I do tend to do as well sometimes during the winter is I actually fish just enough weight just to hold bottom, but knowing full well that actually that bait is going to move. And I fish it in an arc, so I'll fish it just gently upstream and allow it just to tease its way around. And during the winter, you've had your floods, it shifted the leaf matter out, the weed has died off and's gone as well. So you know, especially on places where you have the ability of fishing it during the summer months. Unfortunately for my challenge, some of those places I've never visited before, so I don't have the benefit of hindsight. So sometimes I am fishing totally blind. So in order to try and find fish like what you suggest, maybe up or below a specific snag, I won't have that sort of knowledge. So I will first of all go to where I think they're being drawn to and holding, and then try and expand from there. Given the amount of time available as well, time is obviously the biggest factor of all of this. If you've got 48 hours up north in Yorkshire, then you know you've got a little bit of time in order to expand on the basics. Those 3 core things I spoke about earlier. And once you've put all of those 3 factors into play, then you can start to, okay, well, I haven't had a bite for 45 minutes. Let's have a little look upstream. Bring in the static rod, get the rolling meat rod out, get it upstream 30, 40 yards, bring it through the swim, get an idea on topography, especially if it's in flood as well. You won't have the benefit of seeing what's on the bottom. So you can actually just almost close your eyes, and with that bait coming through, you're feeling the bait and the shot just bouncing along the bottom. You're picturing that bottom, whether it drops down from 7 foot to 9 foot. You're thinking, okay, that's just dropped a bit there. That would be a natural place for a fish to hold up to, and you start to build up that picture. And sometimes you'll pick up a fish off of the main shoal in an area just like that, upstream. So it's not always the best place to target. But for me as a travelling angler, with sometimes the time constraints that I have, that for me would be my focus, and areas akin to that. If I had more time, I would explore further for sure. I'm just trying to think of a time actually when that has benefited me. Probably say that the Warwickshire Avon was a prime example of that. Fishing where I thought would be an area where I would catch a fish, didn't. But very quickly changed it up and had a fish within 15 minutes. Wow. So it just goes to show moving stuff around, even within the same swim. You don't have to move physically, but you just change your approach slightly and it draws a fish. Some would say it's luck. Happy to say it's a mixture of both, a little bit of knowledge and luck.
I think good angling.
Who knows?
Any thoughts on some of those principles, Tony? Agree, disagree?
Agree and disagree. So I think the danger being is that if you look at all these different things and all the different possibilities, and like I say, upstream of a holding it, downstream of a holding area, shallows that become, you'd end up almost fishing everywhere, and you haven't got the time.
Correct.
None of us have got the time.
That's where I find myself.
I've got probably more time than most, to be fair, in my current situation. However, I still haven't got the time to be fishing absolutely every possible spot out of all the different combinations and what have you. You'd never go home. So you've still got to try and play the odds. But I think where you're spot on is that under these different conditions, especially high water, suddenly something that you wouldn't look at under normal conditions suddenly looks the part, and it doesn't have to be an awful lot. And I think it's what you're saying about that little kind of crease or that little sort of area of sort of almost calmer looking water and stuff like that by the bank, that under normal situations we could probably look at there's not going to be anything here. All of a sudden you're walking along and you recognise the look of the water and you go, oh, actually, yeah. And especially, like I say, if it's close in, by the bank, you sometimes get the situation when you got this extra water and it changes the kind of dynamics of the river. And where you'd have maybe, an overhang or something like that pushes all the water out to the far side or something like that. Now it's coming through, and that big slack area and stuff like that was all looking great perhaps in the summer months or whatever, or even in the autumn. Now it's pushing right through those branches and stuff like that, and making it all pretty uninviting and not a nice environment. But it might have created this little slack area that's another 20, 25, 30 yards downstream. Only a little, might be a yard wide. But all of a sudden, you've got this, that wasn't there before. You've got this area of good-looking water and what have you, and you think, yeah, they've pushed maybe down from underneath the branches and stuff like that and what have you, and they could be down there. So disagree and agree with you at the same time, if I'm allowed to do that. That these different conditions do create these other little areas within a swim or what have you that wouldn't be there normally, and all of a sudden, that's the place you want to put a bait. That's where they're going to be.
And being mobile and making sure that you're not too bogged down with tackle, you can move around and take advantage of little things like that.
Yeah.
If you got that mindset of just going, okay, I'm just going to go fish 6 hours in the car park. I don't want to go and do an awful lot of walking. I'm just going to put a rod out and speculate. That's fine. That will be some people's approach. And I totally understand for some people that walking a mile to those areas where we might find those little slacks that maybe weren't there during the summer that actually are now holding fish. Some people won't want to put that time and effort into getting down there, but remaining mobile means you can search out those little locations. And it might have dropped a foot and now that crease is gone. So that natural holding area now doesn't exist and won't now for another, say, 2-3 weeks until you get another rise of water. So again, it's all about timing. And when you get an extra 2 or 3 foot of water on top of that crease, again, the crease might disappear, and obviously during the winter, you get a lot of trees coming down, you get much greater volumes of water coming through. The topography at the bottom is constantly changing. You got snags being ripped out and other ones are being formed as trees are being weakened in the bank and they're falling in. There's various different things that are going to change over just a single winter.
Yeah.
So alluding back to what you were saying when you had that big barbel off the lee, that crease may only be there for 1 month. The rivers can change that fast. So you've got to have the ability to not rule anything out. But at the same time, if you have time constraints, it's not to spread yourself too thin. It's to try and eke the most out of the time that you have and go to those areas where you think is most likely going to provide you with a fish. Because let's face it, we don't mind blanking, but we'd rather catch.
We are there to catch a barbel at the end of the day. We're going to tie together rigs and baits and approaches all in one conversation in a minute, but I do just want to say a little bit about floodwater safety if you're going to fish in those conditions, because it would be irresponsible if we didn't. I mean, we all hear it all the time, every winter, but for good reason, because they are probably the most dangerous conditions we can fish in. So I suppose, Tony, top few tips to make sure people can do this safely if they decide to get out there.
One thing I've changed perhaps over the years and stuff like that is not just thinking about keeping warm, but keeping safe. And I've changed my footwear. And looking at those sort of outdoor shops and sort of, almost sort of, climbing mountaineer and getting some proper walking boots with really good grip. I mean, as you get older, I think your balance and all the rest of it is affected, and your joints and all the. So, so I've started looking at it just a little bit more carefully, and I've had some mates who've been in some pretty dicey situations fairly recently, just in the last few years. And so, I've changed my footwear and less interested in keeping that sort of bottom of my legs and such like, keeping that dry, but more interested in keeping them warm, even if it's oxygen or what have you, but also having the grip of those really warm winter boots with proper soles and stuff like that. And I think the other thing, to be fair, is actually just getting to know your environment. And I think if it's proper dodgy and you really don't know where you're going and what have you, then maybe go somewhere where you're more familiar. I can give you one classic example of where I nearly come a cropper myself. It was years ago on fishing the Ouse, and it was in the sort of conditions that we were talking about, and it's raining and the river's coming up and stuff like that, and got really absorbed in my fishing and the river's coming up and stuff like that. I don't remember catching anything, so it maybe wasn't all that great. But eventually, okay, better go home and what have you, and starting to put my gear together, and you suddenly become aware that, hang on, things, and looking at, and behind me, I'm sat on probably an area of grass no bigger than this room, and all around me, not just the river in front of me, but behind me, it's water. Oh, that's it. I mean, I've walked across the field and such like to get there, and it was perfectly dry. Now there's water everywhere and stuff like that, and you're trying to think, well, how much has it come up? How much water is actually in that field behind me? And what I had to do eventually is to walk along the riverbank until I came to a kind of a fence. And then, there's sort of by the fence posts and where the bottom of the fence is, there's more grass and other bits and stuff that kind of grow up around the bottom of the fence and stuff like that. So it's going to be a bit higher than everywhere else. And just crab along that that kind of fence line. And I mean, it was coming quite high up, and you think, thank God I didn't walk across the field. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm getting wet feet and stuff like that. But at least I'm not suddenly out there and up to, you know what I mean, and thinking, hang on, this is getting dodgy. And am I suddenly going to go, because usually these fields have got little runoff areas and stuff like that, where it suddenly goes a couple of foot deeper, and you don't want to be, especially when you've got all your kit on. So I had to go along, get onto this fence line, and just crab along it for the width of a field, until they got, proper dry areas and such like, and then go back and take the kind of normal route.
James, top tips for safe floodwater fishing from your experience?
Always make sure that somebody knows when you're going, where you're going roughly. Obviously, my missus, I'll always say to her, I'm going down to Bristol Haven tonight, and I'll be back tomorrow morning, but probably anything between 5 and 8 in the morning. It's good to let at least somebody know that you're going, because in floodwater conditions, it might not necessarily be bad when you get there, but things can change very quickly, especially during the winter. Big southwesterly systems drawing tons of warm air, lots of rain. Rivers can respond really fast in the winter as well on sodden ground. So you've got to be prepared. So letting someone know that you're actually going, first of all, is probably a good one. Secondly, I always tend to look at the River Levels app on the government website. So if I'm heading to, take again, Bristol Haven, very well catered for in terms of the gauges. I don't often look at the gauge I'm going to fish. I will look at the gauge of 2, 3, 4 above, so I can see whether the river is steady, rising, or indeed falling. Then I can have a good idea working my way back to where I'm going to be fishing as to roughly what the levels are. I will know whether the river is going to be unfishable, whether it's going to be safe to fish, or if it's going to be relatively standard conditions, which obviously then I won't have any issues with. So it's always a little bit of forward planning. Sometimes only 12 hours in advance. I could be at work in the morning and arrive at my client, be like, okay, well, I know I've got 8 hours, 9 hours of work, go home, load the vehicle, 3 hours to Bristol or Bath or wherever. I know I've got that 12-hour window. So I will keep looking in the morning to see how it responds across those 3 or 4 gauges above. And then if it is going to continue to rise and gets to a certain level, then I will cannon it, go somewhere else. And it's just having that ability to sack it off. Just because you built it up for the last 6, 7 days, I'm going to the Avon tonight. Yeah, I'm going to have it right off. And then turns out that actually it's totally unfishable. You got to have that ability just to say, no, that's it. That's just stupid now. It's getting to a point where it's unsafe, not worth it. At the end of the day, it is just fishing. Go somewhere, it's going to be a bit more sedate, And then I'll be like, I'm changing up my mind. I'm going to go Blackwater, or I'm going to go Kentish Stour, something like that, where they're not as impacted by vast amounts of rain because they have much smaller catchments and they're not going to respond as fiercely as something like the Avon does, and it has done over the last 2 weeks. It's been pretty high and fished it in some pretty dicey conditions already, to the point where I even questioned my reasons for being there. And once you get to that point, you probably already overstepped the mark. So you need to pull yourself back from that and say, okay, now I know those conditions, looking at the levels on the Rivers app, I know that now those levels are not suitable for me to be there. Therefore, next time I plan and the conditions are similar, I just won't go and I will go somewhere else. And then something that Tony alluded to, footwear is massive, especially on already sodden ground, getting wet again. Footwear, it's worth investing the money in. 100, 150, 200 pound pair of boots. People shouldn't gulp at it, spend money, because something cheap, 20, 30 quid is most likely not going to cut it. And it's worth investing in it because it could be the difference between you getting out of a swim and not.
I think that's some really good tips there. So make sure you've got the right kit. Make sure you kind of know what to expect and also know when to call it a day. I think that's a really interesting point as well around kind of making a note around what a water level actually looks like on the ground, because you can see the river levels on the government website, as you said, but that doesn't really tell you what the river's going to look like when you get there. Right. So I think it's important to, if you fish a river regularly, almost make note of what those conditions actually look like and when it is just too extreme. Yeah. And as we've said, there are rivers that are far more civilised to fish in floodwater and those that are very extreme. And I think, it's not worth risking your life for. I suppose from my own experience, I think it's a classic, but using a long bank stick just to feel your way around, that is so helpful. Even if there are quite defined swims, trying to figure out where those swims start and end is pretty difficult in floodwater. Even if you've only got a few inches of coloured water, you can't see where that bank ends. So just have a prod around with a storm pole before you step anywhere in floodwater. I think that, for me, is probably the most useful tip. Just make sure you know where the bank actually is. But I think that's crucial to make sure people can do it safely. So, I'm going to start with you on this one, James, because you've mentioned this a few times. I want to capture a bit more about rigs, baits, and more general approaches now. So I'm going to give you two scenarios, and I want to hear how you would approach the river in the winter in each of those. So, firstly, a winter river that's quite clear, where you've got favourable temperatures. So you've got mild weather and southwesterlies. You've had a bit of rain, but it's not brought the river up, it's not coloured it. So the temperatures are favourable, but you've not got floodwater. And then the second is that floodwater fishing. So two winter rivers, but in very different conditions. How would you approach the first and then the second?
Rolling meat. Any visibility will be my go-to. It doesn't have to be scented. It can just be straight out of the tin, or it can be sauce luncheon meat or the Robin Red luncheon meat if you want a little bit of colour. But it's just that sense of fish picking up something just on the fly. Whether that's summer or winter, you will pick up barbel rolling meat and have done for years. If there is good visibility, that will always be my go-to to begin with. And then from that point, if I haven't caught anything or haven't seen anything, I will slowly switch it up. So when you're going to fish in a clear water during the winter, I do tend to keep relatively short hook links, even though it is winter. You would have thought that fish it's clear, not winter. So if it's clear, you'd fish a slightly longer tail, probably around about 18 inches, 24 inches. During the winter, I try to keep my hook links around about 8-10 inches long. I don't tend to go much longer than that. I just want to keep the lead fairly close because the bites tend to be a little bit more tentative. And also you might pick up the occasional chub and bream along the way as well. So just whatever you get a bite from, you want to pick it up. During the summer, just briefly I'll go on to, I will tend to use a longer hook link. I just want to keep that lead away from the fish because they're a lot more active. I don't want them bumping into the lead, whereas during the winter they're less active and more precise, I think. And you're going to have less fish feeding as well. They'll pick their times as when they do it. When the river's really, really, really coloured, I will tend to, because obviously with really heavy floodwater, you'd have to step up your gear anyway. That's just natural. Anything from £10 during good conditions, I will up it to £12 or £15 during heavier floodwater. Increase the lead size to whatever's suitable to the conditions and the swims that you're fishing in. Don't be afraid to keep changing the lead size in order to make sure that you're just holding bottom. Do like it sometimes to just gently move, because quite often what that can be is actually your bait is drifting into the spot where actually the barbel may feed most prominently. During floodwater conditions, I tend to fish a very short hook link, 6-8 inches, nothing much. You haven't got to worry about then that element of the fish seeing the feeder or the lead. They probably got 6 inches visibility in really heavy floodwater anyway, at best. So you're fishing completely on scent. Whereas during the winter on a clear river, I'm going for visibility. So the difference, I'm just utilising the fish's senses more than anything else. Winter, when it's clear, visibility. Winter, when it's murky, scent. And that's pretty much my go-to on any river I fish.
So I suppose just two questions on that then. So firstly, do you roll meat regardless of the conditions first? And secondly, what about different bait types depending on the conditions, or are your baits the same regardless?
I don't tend, but we'll go with the first point first. So rolling meat, I will quite happily roll meat, whether it's coloured or clear. And sometimes for the coloured rivers that I don't know, and obviously where you don't have the benefit of seeing the bottom, you can build a picture of the topography and certain elements that might play into your favour. Knowing certain areas that you can't necessarily see from above, looking down, you can feel them running through. And I know that sounds crazy, but once you've rolled meat enough, you do tend to be able to build a picture for what is in front of you under the water, just simply by running through. You can kind of work out depths of water. So as it got lots of remaining weed still, as the ribbon weed not quite died back, you can feel it just tugging a little bit. It's like, okay, it's not completely clear. And then you can work out that. Whereas during the clear months, I'm just going through, when I'm rolling, when it's clear, just going through and just flicking the bait, and I'll just run it through not snags, but like overhangs of trees, from nice big weed beds running alongside. Be different things I'll be looking for. But as for when it's floodwater, I will tend to stick to one or two baits, and that's it. I don't tend to pull away. Sauce, boilie with matching paste is my go-to, and something we spoke about earlier that I've started using, the hot crab and krill. I don't know whether there's any correlation behind it, but I just thought a couple of the rivers I'm fishing at the moment have got vast populations of crayfish, and I just wonder whether the bait is quite similar in terms of scent to what the fish are picking up and eating the crayfish. And I just wonder whether there's anything there. It might be completely rubbish, but in terms of my thought process behind it, but I've used it once, had a barbel, so I'm going to use it again and see whether that will actually improve my catch rates, because the sauce on the Blackwater I've struggled with, but the sauce on other rivers is incredible. So I just mixing it up a little bit, trying to change up my approach, not necessarily in terms of how I present it, just the bait that I'm presenting, and just try and move it around a little bit and see whether I can find a sweet spot.
But it's always either meat or boilies, really. That is as simple as it gets.
Certainly during the winter months, yes. During the summer and the autumn, back end of the summer through autumn, pellets will feature heavily in my approach. Quite often, actually discarding boilie altogether, and we'll either fish rolled meat, or I will fish 8mm pellet on a relatively long tail and PVA bag of pellet just to get something close by my hook bait, and then spray pellets upstream and roughly fall around the area that I'm presenting my hook bait with my PVA. And that also is a deadly way of engaging barbel, but also keeping them there as well. And that's part of the difficulty. You might pick one off, great, fantastic, you've caught, you're not blank, that's what we're going for. But if you focus bait in a certain area during the warmer months, you can obviously have multiple catches. During the winter, it's a little bit different. So you probably got a feeding spell of 15, 20 minutes. You're most likely only going to get one bite. So I would like to have just one big bait and pick them up if I can get one. There's always the assumption that we're going to go and catch one every time we go. It doesn't happen. So the tactics that we're deploying don't necessarily guarantee you a fish. But it's just through experience, through all the watercraft and catching fish on these baits that you have confidence in, is the more often you go, the more likely you are to actually catch. And I think over time, you'll build up a picture in your head whether it's going to work or it's not. And I think with the boilie and paste approach, it seems to pick up fish when actually it doesn't look like you're going to catch on anything else, rolling meat included.
Tony, same question, except with one additional scenario. So we've got warm temperatures, but a fairly clear river. Mm-hmm. We've got full-on floodwater, trees, dead sheep, the lot. Yeah. And we've got somewhere in the middle. We've got maybe a falling river where you've got a tinge of colour still, and the conditions are good, but it's neither one extreme nor the other.
Yeah.
How are you approaching them differently? Or are you approaching them differently?
Boilie. Perhaps some boilie paste, matching boilie paste and what have you, and PVA bag of different size boilie bits, if you like, in a PVA bag, and it's usually as simple as that, no matter what. I mean, we're talking about, my barbel fishing it's all in the autumn, winter months, and so it's not, very, very rarely in those clear, low water conditions. So I would maybe ultimately approach a little bit in those, but I'm not fishing in those conditions. I tend to fish a pretty big hook bait. I'm not after numbers. If I'm being, that's not strictly true. Very rarely am I looking for a bite. Every now and again, I will do, because I just, I might go to the Trent and such like, and 2 rods. Okay, let's get a bite. Let's fishing for big fish as well, but let's get a bite as well. And so maybe I may on 1 rod ultimately approach, but ultimately I'm after a big fish. And the way I go about my barbel fishing is pretty simplistic. And I guess it's been honed down, to that over the years. I fish boilies, baits that I've got real confidence in. Yeah. Years ago, the source, I've only changed the complex T more recently, just because I almost felt that I needed maybe another bait rather than fishing absolutely the same bait. But to be fair, if complex T hadn't come about and such like, I wouldn't have worried about it. I quite happily used, source for 20 odd years. It really suits what I do, and it suits that simplicity. Boilie, paste, crumb, what could be easier with a good bait? And I think we may have talked about it, I can't remember whether the recording or not, we were talking about earlier, a good bait is always a good bait. Source is a really good bait. So why worry about it? Why kind of make yourself sort of, start worrying about bait when you don't have to? Maybe just as a change bait, you maybe convince yourself that, you've kind of caught most of the fish in that area on the same bait. Would they maybe be spooked off it and such like? Probably not. But just in case, and have a change bait, and I did that with the complex D, and then found that I caught just as much on that as I was with the source. So I've got 2 great baits, at my disposal. So that's cool. I don't have to worry about it. The only times maybe I would change from that really basic sort of, big boilie on the hook, with a PVA bag and the paste around the lead, such like. Maybe the only time I change, like I say, we go and fish the Trent on occasions, 2nd rod, and it's the pellet. And then even in the sort of high water conditions, even in the winter months, whatever, a small pellet. And I think maybe it's because those Trent fish have been under the pressure so much, and they see so many small food items, and I think that sort of smaller pellet type approach works for them. And again, keep it really, really simple. 8mm garlic pellet hook bait, fantastic. It's going to catch your barbel from, again, anywhere, so you don't have to make it more complicated than that. Have a few of them in your sort of PVA bags and your feed and stuff like that, and what have you. Mix it up with something else in the feed. Have one of those little garlic, pellets on a size 12 and such like, and away you go. Really simple. It's interesting talking about the rolling meat, and James, because I always think I really should, if I'm going to expand on anything in terms of my bait and approach, I really should get to grips with that. But I've thought about that for 20 years, and I still haven't got around to it. I know Ray Walton, who just about started all that, and he was doing that, even on the rivers I was fishing, like I say, 20 odd years ago. Oh yeah, he's got something going there, you know what I mean, ought to get. And I guess now in 20 odd years, and I haven't got around to it, maybe I'm not going to, I don't know. But I think I know it's good. In the right conditions and the right swims and stuff like that, without a doubt, I know it's good. So if I was to change anything going forward, I'd maybe incorporate that every once in a blue flash, but we'll see. I might not.
It's so interesting. I mean, rolling meat is something I've never done, and it is interesting hearing you talk about it, James, because it's clearly devastatingly effective, and it's not implemented that much even now. So it's clearly an edge if you can get good at it. So I think that's something that, we should all maybe put on our agenda. So my winter barbling is quite different to both of you, actually. That's why I suppose these panels are going to be interesting, because we all have slightly different approaches to achieve the same thing. But my winter barbling now is either split into meat fishing for proper floods, and I do nothing but fish with meat, and I don't feed anything. But I don't roll meat. I just rove around with meat and spend a small amount of time in each swim. And then when the conditions aren't quite so extreme, then I'll fish boilies. And again, it was influenced by a really good barbel angler, a barbel angler called Dave Chambers, who both of you may have heard of. He's passed away now, sadly. But I met him fishing the River Rother in Sussex. And I was struggling like crazy on that river, like in any conditions. And he was catching barbel probably every other trip, and I was just racking up blanks. But I remember seeing him fishing in a big flood, and that was it was almost a spate river there, bizarrely, even though it was quite lowland. It rose really quickly and dropped quickly, and it rose like, it might only be 3 or 4 foot deep for most of the part, and then it would be sometimes 12 foot to the top of the bank in a big flood. And I remember seeing him fish it in a flood with meat, and I think he caught 3 barbel that morning. And it was quite a low stock bit of river, and I just could not believe that was even possible. And he showed me what he was doing. He was literally just fishing cubes of meat. And he said, in a big flood, I would just do nothing else, because it's so simple, and it's just, he claimed, more effective than anything else he'd ever done. But then as soon as the water starts to take on that greeny tinge, rather than having that really like dirty brown floodwater tinge, he'd go, that's boilie water now. And he'd know exactly when it was time to stop fishing meat and start feeding a few small boilies. And that's what I've tried to apply to my own fishing, because he just seemed, again, streets ahead of anyone else down there, and knew exactly when to do what in different conditions. So that's what I've tried to take forward in my fishing. But it's so interesting, because obviously both of you are very successful, and Tony, obviously you don't switch things up that much. James, you do, but in a different way than I do. So there's clearly a lot more than one way to skin a cat. So I suppose that's why it keeps it interesting. I mean, how do you guys feel about like maggot fishing in the winter in difficult conditions? Do you ever go down that approach?
I have done. Yeah, I have done with some pretty good success as well, especially in the colder weather, when obviously the minnows are not a problem and the other silverfish activity is really non-existent almost. Can be a massive edge, especially on the Trent as well. I know a lot of guys will still go down there and heave out 20mm boilies with tons of pellets and other stuff in there. Yet the matchmen are going down there and fishing double red maggot on the float and having 6 in an afternoon. And it's like, I think that's where the safe money is. But it's definitely something that is underutilized in the winter. And I will confess I haven't done it an awful lot, but when I have, it's been with quite a decent amount of success. Picked up some good chub along the way as well, which is always nice to slip a net under a low 6 pound chub when you're targeting barbel. It's always a nice little surprise. But it's a tactic that I should deploy more, especially when the conditions are right for it, low and clear. You know that the silverfish activity has been dumbed down. It's definitely something that will pick up barbel. And quite often as well in the winter, they're happy picking up tiny little bits. And sometimes a big bait is not always the right approach. But this is where you don't necessarily have sometimes the time in order to work that out. You kind of have to go with what you're confident with. Sometimes it's not going to work. Sometimes it will. And the maggot approach is just another string to your bow. If you can go down there and you have the time to switch it up, if you've spent 6 hours moving around a few swims and haven't had anything on the boilie or the meat, maybe a little 30-gram black cap, and then just get it in a similar sort of area to where you've been fishing the boilie and the meat with no success. Sometimes you can draw a bite out of a swim using that instead with just size 14 hook. I would never go anything smaller than that. But size 14 hook with a couple threaded through on a hair with a tiny little feeder, relatively short hook link, and you pick yourself up a fish. And sometimes it does work. But I should do it more.
Tony, you were shaking your head when I said maggots, so I don't get the impression that it's something that you have in your armoury.
Not for me barbel fishing. But I think what James was saying about the conditions being right for the maggot, I probably wouldn't be out barbel fishing anyway. And I think it's also, better on certain rivers. And I think those bigger rivers where it gets match fished, where you get people using that chucking in gallons of maggots at a time, I think it's probably better on those sort of places, so the only sort of river that I've sort of fished over the last few years where that would apply would be the Trent, and I don't think I'd be going to the Trent when it's cold and clear in the winter. Simple as that. So I mean, it's obviously good and produces plenty of fish in the appropriate conditions. I'm probably not going to be there, so it doesn't really need to come under into play for me. And you could say that the sort of boilie fishing with a pace and just a PVA bag and stuff like that. Well, it's pretty lazy fishing, but maybe it is. But I've also been reasonably effective, even on somewhere that I don't fish an awful lot. I mean, I've had a couple of 16s and stuff like that, and there's plenty of track angles. We go, actually, I wouldn't mind a couple of 16s, actually. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? But again, I'm not fishing for bites. I'm not fishing for numbers. As impressive and as fun as it might be, I'm usually out there trying to get a big one. And that big boilie approach, especially if you start going a little bit bigger than most of the others, not afraid to use an 18 or a 20 or whatever, do you know what I mean? So it's kind of different again. And it seems as if that's sorting out the better fish for me. So I'm happy with that. And don't have to go to all that expense and hassle and stuff like that of, a gallon and a half of grubs and because it's not easy. Suits some people, and I can see how it would be fun if you're geared up for doing that. But my trips to the kind of rivers and places where it would be most effective, it's probably not going to happen in the first place. So I don't have to worry about it.
I think you captured a few points. I mean, number one, it is a very expensive way to fish. And it's a lot of hassle. But I think also, thirdly, you need to make sure your location's then right, because maggot fishing is not a traditionally mobile way to fish. So it's a very expensive way to waste a lot of bait if you're not fishing in the right place. So I think if you don't need to do it, then I can certainly see why you wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
So we spoke a little bit about baits, rigs, approaches. Let's talk finally, I suppose, about baiting. So I think you touched upon it a few times already, James, around maybe how much you feed, when. So let's start with you. So I suppose firstly, do you feed at all in the winter? If so, what and how much?
Tough one. For me, I always have that, when I haven't caught anything and I'm fishing, my approach that I'm most confident in, which is boilie and paste or nice big lump of meat. If I'm fishing static in dirty water, I come away thinking, should I have actually fed to try and induce a bite? Was there not enough scent trail down there in order to get something to come up into the area where my hook bait's presented? And that's the question that I constantly ask myself when I've packed up and I'm on the way home. Having driven 240 miles to the venue in the first place, I want to come away with something. And if I can come away with complete success and chalking off that river and having a double figure barbel, I'm always wondering when that doesn't happen was my approach wrong? Should I have fed? Or if I have decided to feed, which is unusual for me in the winter, should I not have fed? Should I have just relied on the scent trail of the paste and the boilie on its own? And that's a question I always ask myself. But when I do catch, and I catch without feeding, I then take that confidence through to my next 2, 3, 4 outings and feel, okay, well, it did it that time. Conditions are fairly similar. I will feed the same way. Or in this instance, I won't feed at all. And then obviously when you're rolling meat, there's no need to feed. You're trying to get that fish, if you can find one, to just be reactionary. Take that bait. That's what I want. I'm not letting that pass. I've been waiting here for 3 hours in this depression and I haven't seen a bean to eat. All of a sudden, I've had an inch cube of meat just come past. No, I'm not letting that go. I'm having it. And then you've got that bite out of nothing. When you're static fishing, you're trying to commit something. And quite often when I fish static, it's only for 30, 45 minutes. That's roughly the sort of time frame I will spend in the swim. And if I hadn't had a bite, I will move. But that's the same problem as well, as if I come away having fished for 9 hours and bunny hop in swims and go home and I'm blanked, I think, should I spend an hour in each of them swims? And that's the turmoil you constantly find yourself within, and should I have done that? Should I have done this in that swim? Well, it looks like I probably should have introduced a little bit boilie, whether it's by hand. If you know it's only about 4 feet deep, you can kind of gauge the fall rate of the bait. It's going to land there, so I'm going to throw it there and get my hook bait here, or PVA bag, some crushed boilies, maybe in half with a couple of whole ones as well, and then get that down there. If you haven't caught doing that, did I feed too much? And it's always the question I'm asking myself when I'm not successful. But when you are, you fall back on that because you've drawn the confidence out of the success on previous trips. And then turns out that actually that's not the right approach. And actually feeding a little bit of bait would have induced you a fish. But you're never to know that. It's constantly ifs, buts, and maybes. You live in a world of hypothetical nonsense. You build up pictures in your head that actually probably wouldn't have existed anyway. The fish might not even be in that swim. So it leads back onto something we spoke about earlier. It's constantly moving around and just looking at areas where you think there'll be possible barbel holding up. And if you haven't got a bite out of it, there could be a number of different reasons, completely detached from your own potential inability to catch them. They might just not be feeding, they might not be there. They may have fed on a rising flood, and you've got there and you got there at the wrong time. So it doesn't matter whether you fed or didn't, you're not going to catch. So it's a really difficult one. But during flood water, I would like to rely on scent, and the paste, I would rely on that more so than anything else.
But your go-to in the winter, am I right in saying it would be to feed nothing? That's your typical approach? Fish just a hook bait?
In a simple fashion, yes. Yeah. I would rely on a big single bait doing the business, like you would on the Lee with a big chunk of meat. You're relying on those natural oils to permeate the water column and hopefully pique a barbel's interest. We know certain parts of the Lee don't have big stocks, very low stock river. So you're relying on a single fish to pick up that scent trail. And that's quite similar across the country with some of the rivers that I fish. I'm not looking at catching numbers like you would on the Trent. Some places I'm looking at a single fish. And if I get a bite, then I've done well, and when you're fishing for such slim pickings, overfeeding can sometimes be the kiss of death. So a single bait just means that if I get a chance, that single bait that's down there is the only bait that's mine. And I like to think the fish will eat it and you'll catch something.
How about you, Tony? How does your approach compare?
Similar. In terms of feeding, very sparingly. Most of the rivers I fish, a pretty intimate kind of situation, and I'm not expecting numbers of fish to be in any sort of single location, single swim or whatever, and I'm definitely after catching them, not feeding them. But I think feeding activity and stuff like that can spur fish into having a go that maybe wouldn't bother. And I do like to, especially on the rivers I'm going to fish a little bit, certainly feed swims and get them used to what I'm going to be sort of presenting to them. But I'm more into, the bigger bait, biggest, not necessarily just a single, but bigger bait, often presented with those sort of, PVA bags, with a mixed different sizes, half baits, crumb, different sizes, and that paste thing as well, like a bit of paste around the lead, something like that, super attraction right around where your hook bait is sitting. Not so much of a fan of sort of like chucking in boilies here and there. I think it's difficult, even on the smaller rivers, trying to guess, and I think it sometimes is guesswork as to where they're going to end up. And and if you're looking at maybe one or two fish just holding up in an area, well, it's kind of pointless putting attractive bait kind of elsewhere in the swim, and not by a hook bait. That's way too much guesswork for me. But I think the PVA bag thing kind of works. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the barbel that are all picking up those bits as well. You kind of chub that might be hanging around and stuff like that. And I think actually even having fish like that feeding on your bait that that you're just including in that little PVA bag and stuff like that can actually draw in more fish from kind of elsewhere as well. Feeding fish attracts feeding fish, almost in any situation you care to think of. And I think sometimes you certainly see barbel sort of having a little feed, in those instances where you do sort of see them in the clear water, have a little feed, and then they seem to peel off and sort of disappear a bit, and they could come back and they've got a mate or two. Well, where do they come from? It's almost as if they've kind of learnt that, Matey Bob's just had Bertie's just had a bit of a feed or something, something nice. Do you know what I mean? Kind of thing. We'll go and follow him. Yeah. Like, I was just about to say, fish can't talk, but they can't talk, but I think they maybe communicate a little bit. It may be sort of body language and stuff like that. You certainly see it. I think probably I see it a lot more often with sort of carp and other species, where they, you'll have maybe an individual or a couple of fish, and they come in, have a little feed, disappear, like I say, and then they bring back their mate. But sometimes you see those fish when they come in and they know there's a bit of food there, their body shape or maybe the fins or something like that, or they've got a bit of different movement about them, and they're interested, and I think maybe that attracts fish. But I think also what sometimes happens, and this is where the sort of PVA bag thing comes in, is I think there can be an actual sound of fish feeding, I think can attract fish, but also I think, and it helps with the baits that we've been talking about, I think they can pass through very, very quickly, and I'm talking about minutes, and I'm not talking about pure digestion, but I think actually sort of, some of the stuff passing through and then being excreted, I think as fish disappear and then they come back, I think fish could have caught up on that kind of, what's going on there. Oh, hang on, and they can smell or taste or whatever it is what Bertie's just been feeding on. So that they'll travel back up and say, hang on, he's found something nice. We'll go back up and we'll follow that, and that kind of ties in, I think, to some of the baits we've been talking about that we prefer. There can be, I think, an extra element in those baits. They've got that kind of quality to sort of trigger that sort of recognition thing going on by other fish, that may be further downstream or whatever, and go, I want a bit of that, and follow that up. But certainly not this sort of indiscriminate loads of bait here and there. And like I say, we're all about catching them, not feeding them. And we want them to feed there, where your hook bait is, not 20 yards downstream or the other side of the river or whatever it might be. You want them just there. And obviously the lower the numbers of fish you're talking about, the more important that becomes. So, sparingly, but do it intelligently, if that makes sense.
Time for closing remarks. So, James, over to you first. What are the most important things that we should have spoken about that we haven't spoken about?
Understanding your surroundings. And what I mean by that is something that I know a lot of anglers, I will say, detest, and that's bream. Bream are your friends on a river. They really are where barbel are present, because quite often they will feed in exactly the same areas. They will reside in exactly the same areas. And when you're picking up bream, people quite often, very quickly, after having 2 or 3, will pack up and move. And that's possibly the worst thing you could do. Yes, they're going to slime up your nets. Yes, they don't really fight that well. But I can almost guarantee you that where bream are present, barbel will also be there too. And something that Tony touched on as well is when smaller fish are feeding, sometimes bream, sometimes chub, that feeding will induce other fish to come in. And bream are quite often the first on bait. And I've noticed it on the Kentish Stour for extensive amount of hours on there, feeding in gin clear water. Bream are always first on the bait. And quite often you look down 20, 30 yards and you can see fins held out downstream and slowly coming up. And the more you feed the bream and the more avidly they feed, the barbel will get a little bit closer. And it's almost like the bream are sending out signals through the water, through the lateral line or whatever. It's almost like excitement, like endorphins, they're eating, they're chewing away, and the barbel picking up that. And it's not a sense of panic or, I'm being targeted. they're happily feeding and the barbel picking up on that confidence. However they do it, I don't know. But they're coming up and keep going and keep going. And you can see the bream quite happily feeding. Now, I know a lot of anglers will see them bream. Oh, for God's sake, please, no. I didn't come here for them. But once the bream have had their feed and the barbel have gained that confidence, they will quite often become the dominant feeder and dash your time to fish. Not straight away, but let the bream have their food. Let the chub have their food. And the barbel will slowly make their way to the head of the shoal. And the other fish will drop back once they've had their feed, or if they felt like they're being pushed off the feeding patch. And then that's when you present your bait.
Very interesting.
Bream me your friends.
Bream me your friends. Tony, any final points that we should have spoken about?
I think we've covered some really good stuff, and I think it's interesting that we're sort of slightly different approaches, but when you look at the basics, actually they're all very similar. But I think a lot of people are maybe put off barbel fishing in the winter months because it's uncomfortable. And I think it's maybe safe to say that actually you make yourself comfortable with the right gear. I mean, we talked about boots and stuff like that and what have you, but actually there's loads of good gear about nowadays, sort of waterproof, stuff and what have you, and really warm padded, items of clothing and what have you. You get yourself just geared up for it. So it's actually a pleasant experience rather than going a couple of times and going, oh, you know what, it's not for me, this, is it? You can miss out, I think, on some of the best barbel fishing going. Certainly when we all seem to prefer our time when it's, in the wet, cold months and stuff like that. It's the time you want to be doing it. So just gear yourself up for it, be prepared. And then I think the other thing is kind of just learning from your experience. We've all talked about that sort of experience, whether it be on different rivers that you then take forward and stuff like that, to different rivers, or just learning about the areas where you sort of caught from, and then taking that to different stretches, different rivers, whatever it is, learning by your experience, and then trusting your instinct almost, from that experience and applying it. Yeah.
Barbel fishing doesn't have to be complicated.
No.
And sometimes we overcomplicate fishing for what reason I don't know. But we do tend to make things that are simple actually really complex. And barbel fishing should be one of the most simplest forms of fishing.
Yeah.
They are
if you look at my approach,
they're relatively
there's nothing
greedy
complicated
fish.
about that. Yeah.
Relatively greedy fish. Well, I don't fish too complicated either. I know some of the detail we've spoken about might sound like it's complicated, but actually it's a pretty simplistic approach for fairly simplistic fish.
Yeah.
Let's have it right. On their day, they can be really, really, really easy to catch.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's not always the case. But it's just about building confidence and understanding surroundings. For me, probably two of the biggest things in winter. In weather like what I can hear above us.
Running off the roof right now. Yeah.
I would probably be sat at home looking outside the window thinking, thank God I'm not sat out in that. But if it's mild, these are the conditions you're looking for.
Yeah. So, give it a couple of hours after this lot's passed over and stuff like that. You're thinking,
Absolutely.
I don't want to be out.
Yeah, you're itching. It's like, I think it's time to get out.
Yeah.
Brave it.
Very topical conversation. Well, thank you, gents. I think it's been really interesting. It's been really interesting to hear the similarities in everyone's approach around the table, but also the subtle differences as well, because I guess that is the beauty of fishing, is that there's always a slightly different way to approach things, and that's what keeps it interesting, right? But I think, if people get the timing right, the location right, and keep the approach simple but effective, then everyone should get out there this winter and do a bit more barbel fishing, because it's when they're at their best, the banks are quietest, and you can definitely got the best chance of catching yourself a PB. So I think that's the probably message I would leave everyone with. Get out there, get comfortable, get the right gear, but just, get on the bank and do it.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Cheers, gents.